So today I'll be talking a little bit about different ways of targeting for address-based sampling. So we heard, I think, both Chintan and Ipek talk a little bit about some of these different methodologies, and we compared two of them. We've heard a lot about address-based sampling so far today, and so I think it's probably not a surprise to most people in this room how expensive it can be, right? So even just thinking about mailing materials, the postage, the incentives, the minimum cost can be $100 for a complete. And when we pull a random sample of addresses, the distribution of completes that we get back, as we all well know, doesn't really match population benchmarks due to differential completion rates. So a lot of studies are trying to do some stratification, leveraging some targeting information to help us proactively combat some of those differential non-response or completion rates. And targeted samples can also be really helpful when the population of interest is not general population. So we've been asked to build some custom panels looking at young adults or smokers. And so this information makes a study that maybe would be prohibitively expensive to do because the incidence of the population that we're really interested in is so low. We have to mail out so many packets that if we can find a way to increase the likelihood of finding someone in that target demographic, we can send out more mailings. And so panels, what we're here focused on, can be interested in this information because it can help us boost the numbers of completes in some of these harder to reach groups and round out the panel. We're all very interested in making sure that our panels are representative so we don't run into the issues that John was just telling us about. And so we leverage this information to really try to make sure that our panel can be as representative of the US population as possible. And there's two main methods. One would be the location-based targeting. So really using census demographic information to try to increase the likelihood of finding someone in a particular group, or the modeled auxiliary data that we heard Ipek talk a little bit about from commercial vendors. So location-based targeting really leverages the information gathered in census data about the neighborhood in which someone lives. And we can think about targeting by tract or census block group. You want to find a group that's homogeneous. And so it can help you really identify someone in your target demographic. The benefit of this is that it's not using that auxiliary information. It's not modeled. But the downside of this is that it really only works for demographics in which our country is residentially organized, right? So we know that there's an issue with racial residential segregation, income, education. And so those are the ones that you can use, but if it's not something where people are segregated in that way, if people are cohabiting like with gender or age or marital status, you can't really use this type of information. And so that's when you might turn to the modeled auxiliary data. And this is where sample vendors are merging into like the delivery sequence file, all of this information from commercial databases or supplemental data files, like leveraging magazine subscriptions, coupon use, shopping information. And so the benefit of this, again, is that you can do the targeting and that it can reach more wide demographics than what we could with the census-based targeting. But the con is that you're relying on this modeling, and we don't maybe necessarily fully know how that modeling is being done and what bias is associated with leveraging that modeling. It's possible that the households are more stable because they've been there longer, so the information is more accurate, or maybe they're more consumer oriented, right? Because we're leveraging a lot of this commercial information. So we wanted to compare both of these modeled targeting methodologies, the modeled and the geodemographic. And so we focused here on the Latino Hispanic population. It's a subset of the population that's of particular interest to us, and we want to make sure that we're doing a good job of representing them. And so to facilitate this comparison, our ABS sample vendor MSG appended their modeled ethnicity code and the Latino population density for census block groups to a knowledge panel recruitment wave so that we could look at the types of people that we would get in the panel with each of these different methodologies for targeting. And for this, we defined the Latino density as census block groups with 50% or more residents who are Latino or Hispanic. And I'll talk a little bit more about how you set that threshold. So first, just looking at the frame composition, the modeled Latino Hispanic households were about 13.8% of the MSG frame. If we look at census block groups with 50% or more Latino, 10.9%. And then I just put the population of US adults about 17% according to the latest CPS. And so the first question is, do these flags identify the same households or do they identify different households? And it looks like largely they're identifying different households. So about 7.8% of the addresses in the sample that we selected had both the Latino ethnicity flag and were in high density CBGs. About 10% had one flag or the other. So 10% were 50% or more, but not the Latino ethnicity. And then same for the opposite. And then most of the addresses were not flagged either way. So the next question, do these flags work? Do they help us recruit or identify a Latino or Hispanic person? And the answer is yes, they're pretty successful there, right? So looking at the modeled, it's 75% of the people who came in and took our core demographic profile when there was a flag for the modeled ethnicity were in fact Hispanic or Latino. And with our CBG 50, it was about 62%. And then you can compare that to the ones that weren't flagged. A much smaller percentage ended up being Latino or Hispanic. And so then it becomes a question of who responds, right? So who are the people that we're reaching with these different methods? So what I'm showing here is the divergence from the CPS benchmark under each of these different ways of targeting someone. And so this is unweighted results. And so you can see if it's below the line, it means we're underrepresenting them. And if it's above the line, we're overrepresenting them. And I think basically what you see is that there's not really a clear picture where one better reaches the population than the other. It's kind of a mixed bag. Both of them, we were low on male. You can see the CBG 50 really overrepresented the low income and really underrepresented the high income. A couple different demographics. So you can see here some region concerns. CBG 50 and the modeled both really overrepresented the South. There's also some concerns about the origin, and it kind of differs by whether or not you're using the modeled flag versus the CBG 50 flag. Interesting, both of the targeting helps with the bilingual and the Spanish population, which is a group that's harder to recruit. And then just a couple of last demographics. I threw in party ID in there, just thought it was an interesting look, and you can see both of them underrepresented independents, and then both of them overrepresent citizens. So it's probably a combination of the typical differential response rates that we experience and the bias that may be associated with using this modeling. So overall, just kind of looking at a summary measure, they both kind of performed about the same. So this is the average absolute difference from the benchmarks, a touch higher for the modeled versus the CBG 50, but really basically no big difference there. It's not like one performed better than the other. And so I mentioned that I would talk a little bit about the CBG density threshold. So when we looked at the accuracy, the CBD density was a little bit less likely to find a Hispanic versus the modeled. And part of that is with how we set the density threshold. So if you go to a neighborhood with a higher density of Hispanic or Latino, not surprisingly, you'll be more likely to find a respondent who's Hispanic or Latino. So you can see here, if you increase the threshold to 65% or more, it puts it basically on par with what we saw with the modeled. But the concern there is that then you start to see some of these demographic skews get exacerbated. So you can see that the metro status drops even further down to underrepresent kind of the non-metro folks. Your region starts to get a little bit more skewed there, where you only have 5% coming from the Northeast. and then your origin gets pretty far off as well. So you have to be really careful when you're setting that threshold of helping find the target demographic of interest, but also then not exacerbating the bias there. So overall, we see that both methods really did help improve the likelihood that we reach the person that we wanted to reach, or the demographic that we wanted to reach. Both demographic distributions diverged from benchmarks, and there wasn't really a clear pattern to help us understand exactly what might be causing the differences. I think it's kind of, again, the difficulty of teasing apart the differential non-response that we all see all the time versus what might be coming from the leveraging of the modeling. So I think kind of all things being equal, it's probably easier to weight away the bias that might come from using the CBG targeting rather than the auxiliary data, because we don't fully know exactly what's the relationship is with the modeled targeting that we're leveraging there. So if there is the opportunity to use the geographic targeting, that seems like a wiser approach. There's also some new privacy laws that a couple of states have enacted around consumer protection that might make it harder for us to leverage that auxiliary information. So I think it's just always wise to strike the right balance. All right, thank you.